So welcome back. I'm so glad you're here. We're going to talk about the stuff that we didn't talk about in the last video comparing New York to the South Central Alaska. So I talked about the Balto statue and trees primarily in that video. So in this one, I'm going to cover the other promised things like housing costs, population, airports, bridges, and maybe more. But let's just get into it and see where we go, because it's kind of a little bit of spontaneity. The very first thing that I noticed on my list was that I talked about water. So in New York City, there's a lot of water. It's actually an island. So I, one point, kind of debated that in my mind, but then I looked at a map, and the Harlem River to the north is what makes it an island. Because if you don't look closely, it doesn't really look like an island. It looks like a little peninsula coming off of, I guess, like Mott Haven or the Bronx is what I kind of saw in my bridge research. And here we have a lot of water. Alaska is full of water. I mean, it's the opposite of somewhere like Colorado or Arizona, where it can be very dry. And of course, there are some very dry spots in Alaska where there are not wells, but everywhere around, I mean, like lower elevations that I know of in the areas I'm used to, we're actually near ocean, and there's actually rivers and glaciers. So in the Matsu Valley at the Kinnick Arm, there's ocean that connects with Anchorage, and they could make a bridge to connect the land, but I'll get into that later too. So thanks so much for coming, and I'm gonna probably be glancing at some notes because it's a lot of statistics to remember and I don't have it all down. But next off, let's talk about population. So New York has 18,867,000 people.
8,468,000 New York City.
And where Alaska, the whole entire place, has 737,000. So New York City, we're talking about the 5 boroughs. So there's Manhattan, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. So Staten Island is kind of like to the south of Manhattan, and Long Island, looking at the map, they consider like the eastern part, it looks like of Long Island, to be part of Queens. So my grandma was born in a little town on Long Island called like Port Jefferson. New York City and South Central Alaska both seem like exciting places to take cruise ships to or from. When I was in New York, I remember seeing some cruise ships in the harbor, and it's just kind of exciting because they're so big and you can see them so well from a high rise. And the cruises in New York sail to Nassau, Bahamas, which is a country that I know is developing, and maybe sad that it's a tourism place, but that's what it is. I've never been to the Bahamas. I've dreamed about going there. Of course, I have probably like a really romantic version in my mind of what the Bahamas are. And so, and in Alaska, I've heard a lot of people taking cruises. I think you take it from Bellingham, and it will take you to see glaciers, and you probably get to see orcas and other types of wildlife. So it's, I mean, I don't think of it as like a cruise like you would think of like a Bahama cruise, but I know people like it. And if you've ever seen the movie Tick, Tick, Boom, there's this great scene in the movie where they're at Jonathan's birthday party in the beginning, and his friend is saying, so I got a call back, and they're like, oh really, what is it for? And he's like, it's for a cruise. And then she says, well, what's wrong with a cruise? And then he says, it's an Arctic cruise, so it's in the Arctic. It's pretty much everything. And I can really relate to that. I mean, I've never been on a cruise. I recently got interested in cruises and started just kind of researching them and watching. There's a really good YouTuber. I'm not remembering her name right now, but maybe I'll link that later. Cruise ships seem to be like pretty good price for a vacation. And I mean, I was talking to my mom about this, and she's been taking me on vacations since I was little. So to me, like, she is probably the person who knows. Like, how much they'll add on later. And I know that that's different for different places, and I guess cruise ships are one of the places that really like to stick it to you with the add-ons. So when I looked it up, it was about like the same to cruise from Bellingham to Alaska or from New York City to Nassau. It was something like $250 for a 3-day cruise, all the way up to, you know, $1,200 for a premium room. So cruise ships are about the same, and I don't know anything about the specific cruise ships or cruise lines or prices or what sails where. I don't know anything about any of that. But it makes sense with all of the water that we have cruise ships in both places. I tried looking up dog statistics, and there's a lot of dogs in New York. It says that 27% of people have dogs. I mean, what I mean by a lot is it says that there's 0 in Alaska, which if we know anything about anything, we know that's not true. I mean, besides mushing, people in Alaska have dogs just like they would anywhere else. Weird statistics are weird like that. Not too helpful. There was enough dogs in New York City, though. If you remember, I think I talked about in my video on Fort Tryon Park on our first day, my daughters got some marionette dogs at the medieval festival. They were only like, I don't know, maybe $5 to $10 a piece, and they were walking them down the sidewalk in Washington Heights, and dogs started barking at them, thinking they were real dogs. That was one of the highlights of our trip and our first day there. Made us feel like locals. Yay! I think all tourists in New York want to come off as locals at least once. Tourism is obviously something that's big both in New York City and in Alaska. We just talked about cruises, but just talking about pure tourist statistics. First of all, New York's is interesting because it really illustrates what the pandemic did. So in 2019, New York was hitting a 10-year consecutive record-breaking. Every year was breaking the record for tourists numbers. It was at 66.6 million. And then in 2020, with the corona, it was down to like 22.2 million. And in 2022, it was back at 56 million. I'm proud to say that I was one of those 2022 tourists. Maybe it was something about being locked in pandemic for all of those years that made me want to go out and see what was going on in the center of the world. Of course, I'm going to say that because I'm such a big fan of New York. How much does New York City earn in tourism? So when it's all said and done, it says they generated about 7.5 billion. It's a little confusing. At first it says, this is on Google, the direct visitor impact spending of 52 billion generated a total economic impact of 85.5 billion in New York in 2021. And then the total economic impact generated 7.5 billion in state and local tax revenues. So in Alaska, the picture's a bit different. It was about 4.5 billion in 2018. 4 billion 2017 is what they're telling me. One cool thing, though, from Google here is Alaska's tourism economy accounted for 1 in 10 jobs in the state. So that sounds pretty good. I don't know. I think there's a lot of workers on tour buses, tours, different things at lodges. So sounds like a cool job idea if you're like young in college in between things. But just remember, if you ever want to do like a job in Alaska, to set that up like at least a year in advance. Because when I was young, I thought I could just come over here and hop into some amazing job. And actually, I ended up working at a farm. Airports. First, I want to talk about just briefly the Anchorage Airport, and then I'll talk about the New York airports, and I'll come back to the Anchorage Airport. But one of my very first good memories as a kid is the airport. I had family down in the lower 48, and so when I was like, I don't know, I mean, probably from the time I was a little baby, I started flying, but I remember being like 3, and the smell of coffee always coming out of the restaurants. Back in Anchorage at the time, there were the ticketing counters and then there was security, but in between you had like restaurants. I remember there was a Cheers restaurant. I don't know if you remember, they had those in a lot of airports, probably not when I was 3, but anyway, they had coffee and it was this really cool like little mall in the middle of the airport, and now it's all been completely redesigned. It doesn't really even smell like coffee anymore. But every time I smell coffee, I think of airports. So let's get back to New York. So my favorite, I'm gonna say, airport of New York City is Newark. And that's because when I used to fly back east to visit family, that's often where we would fly into or out of, because little airports are not very cost effective. And so the biggest thing about that is to make sure that you don't accidentally drive into New York City. I remember some stressful trips of like my mom or my stepmom driving. I've never done that myself, but if I did go back, that's probably where I would fly into. So interesting details about Newark International Airport. It is the 13th busiest airport in the world as far as traffic. There's a lot of different flights from a lot of different countries. It's a hub for FedEx and United Airlines. Another interesting thing about that airport, so its location is actually in two different counties. It's in New Jersey, but one is in Elizabeth, which is in Union County, and the other one is in Essex County, so it's in two districts. So back during World War II, this had two different airfields. So in 1919, it was Heller Field, and then in 1924, it was Hadley Field, and these were postal service airports. So after the war, I think that they're saying, what I read, that the Postal Service didn't want to be in that location anymore. They wanted to go closer to New York City, so they made this all one big Newark International Airport in 1928. So while the airport is owned by these different counties of Essex County and then Elizabeth and Union County, it's also, like all of the other airports, operated by Port Authority. And if you're in Newark, you can ride the air train. You can ride the Air Train Newark. This is from Wikipedia. Air Train Newark connects the terminals with the Newark Liberty International Airport Station. This station is served by NJ Transit's Northeast Corridor Line and North Jersey's Coast Line. Amtrak and Northeast Regional and Keystone Service trains also stop at the station. So I'm going to assume that this goes over to like World Trade, because when we were in World Trade, there were signs to Newark. I don't know. I could go look on my phone and figure it out, but you could too. I'm going to have to do so much research for these videos. I'm not going to go into that. So let's get into the other airports. Let's talk about JFK. JFK is the one that we flew into last time. And JFK, interestingly enough, used to be a golf course. So it was called the Idlewild Golf Course, and there was also a hotel there. It's located in Jamaica, Queens, and it used to be called the Jamaica Sea Airport, which I think is very fitting because when we flew in, I was excited to see New York City and everything, but I was used to flying into Newark. I wasn't used to all of the ocean, and the first thing I saw was just like the rough, white-capped, gray Atlantic, and that was really pretty cool because that's what I'm used to seeing not the Atlantic, but I'm used to seeing the ocean flying into Alaska, very much like that, very gray and white capped, and everything's very much overcast. JFK opened in 1928. That makes it 20 years younger than Newark, which we previously talked about. Its name was changed from Idlewild to Robert F. Kennedy. You can take the air train from JFK to Midtown Manhattan. It's actually quite simple, and I would recommend it. Last but not least, we'll talk about LaGuardia. LaGuardia is located in East Elmhurst, Queens. So this is where Bowery Bay and Flushing's, Queens meets. It forms a point here. And interestingly, back in 1886, I believe it was, a rich, wealthy man was going to build a resort here. And he started to, and it resembled Coney Island is what people were saying. But it didn't last after the war because of, the economic impact and for some reason anti those bad people in World War II, I don't know, it was just not a good time or place to have a resort anymore, so they turned it into an airport. And that is what we have now since 1938 is the LaGuardia Airport. So that puts it as the middle child between, I was going to say Queens, JFK in Queens, and then Newark in Newark. I might have already mentioned the proximity of Newark because that's like one that it's easy to think that it's not really close to Midtown Manhattan, but it actually is. So when you Google it, you have 25 minutes from Newark to Midtown. JFK, from JFK to Midtown Manhattan is 29 minutes. And from LaGuardia, it's 20 minutes. Ted Stevens International Airport in Anchorage is the world's 4th busiest airport as far as cargo. And it's the 2nd busiest airport in the U.S. Ted Stevens opened in 1951. We had a really bad earthquake in 2018, and the airport had to be shut down for repairs. So this airport used to be known as the crossroads of the world because it's a midpoint between Europe and East Asian countries. During the Cold War, the Soviets had their airspace shut down, and so planes would stop in Alaska midway through. But then towards the end of the Cold War in 1988, they didn't need to stop here anymore. And that lost the state $80 million a year in revenue. And also due to some upgrades, a new Boeing jet, they had no reason to stop here for refueling, but it's traditionally known as a place to stop for refueling. And I think that maybe that's why like the presidents still like to stop here sometimes, even though they probably don't have to. Maybe presidents, being studied up on their history as they should be, think, well, let's just do this historical stopover. We'll get to see Alaska, we'll make an appearance, and we'll be satisfying our historical nerdiness. And I believe it was in 2018 they announced that there was going to be a nonstop flight from Anchorage to Harbin, China. So I don't know if this has actually happened, but I thought this was cool because I had a teacher in acupuncture school who was from Harbin, China, and he would talk about how it's so much like Alaska, except that it's we weren't even in Alaska, but we were in Portland, Oregon. But he talked about the ice sculptures and how it's actually colder than Alaska. It will stay like 20, maybe 40 below, or maybe even more for month stretches at a time. So while here we have the ice sculptures, here we have more snow sculptures, there they have ice sculptures. In Fairbanks, Alaska, it gets also colder than the regions, the south central regions, and so they have ice sculptures. And so let's talk about Fairbanks's airport. I've only been to the Fairbanks airport one time, and that's when I was flying back from Portland in September, and the winds were so strong we couldn't land in Anchorage. And in typical airport, impatient passenger fashion, I didn't want to wait the 12 hours for a new plane. This reminds me of like the scene from Home Alone. And we rented a car and we drove back to our area of Alaska, which is like 7 hours. So, we got here faster, and it's a really beautiful, it's breathtaking to drive from Fairbanks to the valley or to Anchorage in September or October. Please do it. It's colors like you've never seen before. It's the boreal forest at its greatest. It's driving through Denali National Park, which, as you probably know, Denali is the tallest mountain in the country. So we talked about population, and when it comes to housing units, so when I look it up on Google, I get that there are 3,469,240 total housing units in New York City. And when I Google how many total housing units there are in Anchorage, Alaska, it says that there is 100,000. As of July 1st, 2021, I'm seeing here that there's 327,890 housing units. So just to be clear, for comparison purposes, we'll compare Alaska's biggest city with Manhattan again. So I already gave us not Manhattan, but the entire New York City population. We already went over that. And the biggest city in Alaska is Anchorage, and Anchorage's population is 288,121 in 2021. Alaska's second largest city, Fairbanks, has 32,700. I would say that the cost of living for those said housing units is about half. Like here, to rent a 2-bedroom house or maybe apartment, it's somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500. And somewhere in New York that isn't like a super high-end fancy area like the Upper East Side or even Midtown Manhattan or even probably some of the nicer spots in like Harlem or Brooklyn or whatever, a rental in somewhere nice that's not like overpriced like Washington Heights or Inwood, somewhere Dominican Republic, somewhere like that is going to cost like $3,000, $3,500. So that's about double of what you would pay here. Weather statistics, I feel like it's about like drop it down about 20 degrees. So in New York in the summer, you're somewhere averaging between 60s and 80s. In Alaska, in like South Central, we're not too far north and we're also not too far south. You're going to be somewhere in the 40s to 60s with some exceptional days in the 80s. And in October, it's similar. In October, it's similar where in Anchorage, we will be in the 30s to 40s average. And in New York, it's more in the 50s and 60s average. We had one really beautiful day there on October like 8th. It was so beautiful and sunny, and that's the day we had to leave. But when we first got there, it was raining and like 55 and really cold. So New York has temperamental weather just like anywhere else. Well, when I searched bridges in Alaska, I was expecting to see more in the list that I knew about. The only one that I know is one between the Mat-Su Valley and Fairbanks, and that's called Hurricane Gulch. And that's pretty scary, just like it sounds. It's actually going over a big mountainous gulch. There's other famous bridges in Alaska, ones that I'm not really that familiar with. But what interests me most about Alaska's bridges is a proposed bridge project that's been going on since the 80s from the Knik Arm to Anchorage. And what this would do is give another route for people from the Mat-Su Valley to get to Anchorage, and it would make it a lot closer for some people. It would only be about 1.5 to 2 miles long of a bridge, and that's not very far. There's bridges in the world. There's a really long bridge in Louisiana that's something like, I think, 50 miles long maybe, and then there's a 100-mile long bridge in China. So it wouldn't be a huge deal, but it keeps getting kicked back. It keeps getting unapproved and not approved for funding because they say that people in the Mat-Su Valley actually don't need to go that way. They actually live more in the area where they would just go the regular way, the Glen Highway, that's been there forever. Okay, not forever, but for a long time. It's the main route that's always been used ever since we've had a route to use. And it's kind of absurd, to use a strong word to me, because especially these days, they've widened the Parks Highway that goes from like Wasilla in the Mat-Su Valley up to like Houston and Willow to 4 lanes, and all the way to Fairbanks, the road is pretty decent. So it doesn't make any sense to say that people in the regions of like what they call rural, so Meadow Lakes, Big Lake, Willow, and Houston, it doesn't make sense to say that there's not as many commuters, because I think that there's just no way that's true. So sometimes truth takes a while to catch up to government and science and statistics, and so I think that eventually somebody's going to put this all together and find out that it would actually be a good plan. So another criticism of the plan is that Goose Bay Road is already like the second dangerous road in the whole state of Alaska because it's a 2-lane highway and there's so many people that live on it. So it's a commuter road in and of itself. So if we're now somehow increasing traffic down KGB so that commuters can get to the bridge, then that's not going to be a good thing, and I get that, but there's other ways. There is another road that connects Point McKenzie with Big Lake, and the name escapes me right now. It goes all the way to the parks, so they could widen that. And of course, I don't know anything about state budget. I mean, who am I to say, oh, I have enough taxpayer money to do it? But I mean, if they do, I think that their reasons for not doing it aren't really adding up. So I've been down to Point McKenzie, at the very end of Point McKenzie, and you look and Anchorage is right there. So it's just kind of excruciating to have to drive all the way around when it could just be down there and straight over. It would, as they say, for people in the area of like KGB, Meadow Lakes, Big Lake, it would decrease their commuting time.
If you live near the Tug Bar, it would take about 35 minutes to get to Anchorage. If you lived in Willow, it would still take you about an hour and 10 minutes.
Wouldn't decrease somebody's commuting time in, say, the areas of Palmer or the Butte or Chickaloon, because they would just get the same amount of time going the other way. But the Matsu Valley is such a big area. I mean, you can't really just compartmentalize us like that. And I'm going to project, like, in the next 20 to 40 years, this Knik Arm Bridge will be built. And I do understand, and I do feel for the residents of Government Hill in Anchorage, because that's one of the most beautiful areas. They have the view of the inlet, they have nice houses, and it's super quiet. And they're kind of like, well, up on a hill, Government Hill. I hope that they find a way to integrate it into downtown so it's not such a big deal. And I mean, maybe it will decrease traffic coming into town the other way, which could be a good thing. So I think that this requires some planning, some careful consideration of everyone. Alaska tends to be very libertarian, and so I think that they tend to put less money into projects and, civil projects, educational projects than other places, which is sad. Although, I mean, if you're from here, you're so steeped in the libertarian ideology that you're going to say, oh, well, fine. But I think at some point, libertarian ideology catches up with practicality, and someday the bridge is going to catch up with Alaska's hearts and minds. So there are some other interesting bridges in Alaska that I didn't mention. One notable that I grew up near going camping and stuff, I think everybody in the valley does, is the old Knik River Bridge. So this is on the Knik River right by Pioneer Peak. There's a huge towering mountain right in front of it, and it just looks very classic. So it's actually a bridge that is not for car usages anymore. It's actually for just for hanging out. But there's one right next to it that parallels it that's for cars. So I remember my grandpa, who passed away nearly a decade ago, liked to stroll that bridge, and I just thought it was kind of funny because I used to think it was just going to fall down. But anyways, we have lots of bridges. There's also the Matanuska River Bridge, which goes over the Matanuska River, connects Lazy Mountain area and the Butte to Palmer. And that's kind of a fun place to hang out. We had a drum circle there a few weeks ago. Hello, drum circle friends, if you're watching. And there's other interesting bridges. So if you drive from Anchorage or the Matsu Valley to Fairbanks, you're trying to go to some hot springs or something, you're going to cross quite a few bridges on the way. I already mentioned Hurricane Gulch, and there's also an exciting one that I forgot about, the Nenana River Bridge. I'll go more into the Nenana River in another video, because there's like a thing that sits on the ice every year, and when it falls in, that's like, that it's spring. So that's like the Groundhog Day of Alaska. So I'm on this website on my lap on alaska.org, and it talks about the Hurricane Bridge at mile 181. This bridge is a connection between South Central Alaska and the Interior Territory. This bridge represents an engineering marvel for the day and age it was constructed, and is as strong today as when it was constructed nearly a century ago. The Knik River Bridge, which I just mentioned, You drive the old Glen Highway to get here, but it's a nice alternative to the main Glen Highway. So it's a windy river road. Please don't drive crazy. Coming from a local. Kusklana River Canyon. I don't know that one, down McCarthy Road. That's like if you go north out of Palmer towards Lake Glen Allen. Cushman Street Bridge, 1917, Festival Fairbanks Incorporated. The Yukon River Bridge, half a mile, only 4 vehicle carrying bridges, only one of 4, and the mighty Yukon. So this is the longest river in Alaska and primary means of transportation during the Klondike Gold Rush. The $1 Million Bridge, this is one that I didn't know about. This was constructed in the early 1900s. It cost a whopping $1.4 million at the time, which earned it the nickname $1 Million Bridge. But the bridge quickly earned its keep, allowing the railroad to haul copper from Kennecott to the port of Cordova. Kennecott Mine is an interesting place that I went one time, where there's a glacier and a mine, and it's really old. It's a really cool tourist place, but it's going to take you like 10 hours to get there from the valley, or from Anchorage about 12. So Veterans Memorial Bridge. Just jump right in. This is the next one after $1 Million Bridge. This is in Fairbanks. It opened with fanfare in 2012. It's with a procession of antique cars borrowed from the Fountainhead Antique Auto Museum and private collections. Very cool. Those were the first to go. Number 8, Pelican Creek Bridge. Pelican Creek Bridge, I've never heard of this one. It's just a few minutes from Pelican's Harbor. It's a great place for viewing salmon that are headed upstream. I have no idea where this one is. I'll show you on a map. Engineer Creek Bridge. Look closely at the limestone outcroppings. The limestone was formed on the floor of a shallow sea about 400 million years ago. Wow, they eventually turned into rock and were uplifted and folded into the mountains. Pieces of coral reef broken by storm waves came to rest in the soft lime mud. Where is this one? Wow. Okay. Next one, this is Sitna River Bridge. So this one, I believe, goes over the Talkeetna River, which is where I grew up fishing. So every time I drive over that one, I'm kind of like scared with the memories of my dad saying, like, don't fall out of the boat. And if you do, this is what you do. And so on and so forth. And I look down and I think about all of our memories of camping on the beaches and sunbathing and even shaving our legs in the river, fishing for silver salmon. We would stay up there for like a week at a time. So I could not drive over that bridge without having tons of memories just flood back. Captain William Moore Bridge, named for Captain William Moore, a pilot, prospector, and hunter. Buskin River Bridge. Range right to Devil's Prong and Barometer Mountain. Wow. Juneau Douglas Bridge. That one must be in Juneau, which I've never even been to Juneau. That's in southeast Alaska. Mammoth Creek Bridge. Alaska has fascinating archaeology. The fossilized remains of many species of pre-glacial Alaskan mammals have been discovered here. These fossils are on display at the University of Alaska Museum in Fairbanks, as well as in the museum in Central. So I'm going to have to go check out that Fairbanks Museum. I'm liking Fairbanks more and more the more I go there to Hot Springs. So let's move on. Number 15. Sargent Creek Bridge, a popular place for viewing wintering emperor geese. 14, Red Cloud River Bridge. I'm just going to start reading these. 17, Rock Creek. 18, Lakina River. 19, the William Ransom Wood Centennial Bridge. 20, Olds River Bridge. 21, Soldotna Bridge. I've probably been to that one. Ogleville River Bridge. 22, it sounds like that's down in the Yukon. John O'Connell Bridge, 23. Chicken Creek Bridge, 24. Fairbanks area. I've heard of Chicken Music Festival. Bridge over Little Chena. Now that sounds familiar. I'm sure I've been over that one recently. East Fork Bridge, mile 43.35 Denali Park Road, so that must be in the park. You can't go in the park without a permit. 26, Fish Creek Bridge. 27, this short wooden bridge crosses the popular salmon fishing creek. And now this is the last one, and I'm just mentioning this one because I go fishing there a lot. every year. I don't recognize this one in the picture. It looks a lot different than that, but it's like a Alaska hillbilly fishing. We go down there and we get out our dip nets and our canoe with our outriggers, and we just start pulling the salmon out of the inlet, which is, it's like right where the water's coming in from the ocean. So they're really wonderfully fresh and they're about to swim upstream. So that's how we do dip netting on Kinnick. Just a little side note, Kinnick was the first settlement of white people, colonists in this area. It used to be that they lived in Palmer. There was the settlers from Massachusetts in the Great Depression. And then there was the Kinnick settlement in the Kinnick. And that's where Joe Reddington moved to and lived with his dog teams and the Iditarod and all of that. So, it feels a little bit like you're in the old times down there. It's like it actually is a town, and you wouldn't think anymore because now the commercial center of Wasilla is like 15 miles the other way. So Manhattan, being an island, has tons of bridges. It has the East River bridges and it has the Harlem River bridges, and there's a few to the west, or more like one, I think, and then there's tunnels. So let me read them off my list to you. So for the East River, there is the very well-known Manhattan Bridge and Brooklyn Bridge, Ed Koch Queensboro Bridge, Williamsburg, Robert F. Kennedy, George Washington, and the High Bridge. So that makes 7 from the East River that connect like Brooklyn or whatever like area in Brooklyn you're in with Manhattan. And then on the Harlem River, starting in the north, there's, I'm probably saying this wrong, the Spuyten-Duyvil Railroad Bridge, Henry Hudson Bridge, Broadway Bridge, Washington Bridge, High Bridge, Macomb Dam Bridge, 145th Street Bridge, Madison Avenue Bridge, Park Avenue Bridge, The Avenue Bridge, Willis Avenue Bridge, and Ward Island Bridge goes to Randall's Island. The Robert F. Kennedy Bridge goes to Mott Haven. There is the Robert F. Kennedy Bridge South, goes to Astoria. In the East River, there is the Hell Gate Bridge, which is north of the East River. So Roosevelt Island sounds like an interesting place that I haven't checked out at all, so I can't really speak much about that. So on the other side, on the west side of the island, there is the George Washington Bridge, which connects the Hudson Heights or Little Dominican Republic area with Palisades Park in New Jersey. So Rikers Island, also the prison complex, also of course has its bridge, the Francis R. Bruno Memorial Bridge. And in the island of Manhattan, Central Park has its own bridges that are mostly, the Bow Bridge, the Gapstow Bridge. They're historical.
Oh, it's so beautiful.
And the tunnels, there is the Hugh L. Carney Tunnel from Manhattan to Governor's Island, and the Lincoln Tunnel from New Jersey to the Times Square area. And then there is the Queens Midtown Tunnel from Astoria to Midtown, and the Holland Tunnel from Newport, New Jersey to Lower Manhattan, Soho. So that makes 4 tunnels. I think I've been in the Lincoln and the Holland. So the Dena'ina people in this area were Athabascan, is what I'm reading. And of course, Alaska has other tribes. It has Inupiaq, I probably said that wrong. And of course, Yupik are the ones that I'm most familiar with. Native culture, I think, brings a lot to Alaska. It's something that I missed in the lower 48 because although in San Diego, for example, there's Old Town San Diego, which has a Mexican theme, but it also has like that indigenous feeling to it. But it's just so much smaller and placed like in a tourism spot. And in Alaska, I think that there's more of a feeling of native culture infused. I mean, for better or worse, for native culture. But in the valley at the Alaska State Fair, now there's a whole native section where there's a stage for native songs and dances, and there's a blanket toss. I got to be involved in the blanket toss one year. I believe that was probably 2019, pre-COVID, and it was a really amazing community experience. I haven't really felt that. I mean, in a lot of other settings, it kind of is like that feeling you get at a concert where like everybody's on the same wavelength. And I've got a lot of my favorite earrings there. They have the most beautiful beadwork, and one year my daughter requested a custom made, like she wanted some earrings that were smaller for her because she was this younger, smaller girl at the time, and she whipped those out in like an hour. So I mentioned some of the native tribes that were around this area in Alaska. I talked about the Bente. Bente means land of many lakes. So now I would like to cover the Native American people that lived in Manhattan. And there are so many like tribes in that area that if you were to go north or south or east just a little bit, or west, you would be seeing so many different tribal names. But what comes up in Manhattan in particular is the Lenape, or I feel like I'm saying that wrong, people, also known as the Delaware River people. And so from a book that I got for our homeschool, this book's called Stories of America, I'm going to read a little bit of it where it talks about the history of Manhattan and when the settlers met with the natives. So, Chapter 5, How the Dutch Came to America. I wonder how many of my readers have ever seen the great city of New York. I wonder still how many of them know that it is one of the largest cities in the world, yet it has not been around so very long. Why, if you should go back no further than the time of your great-great-great-grandfather, you would find no city of New York. All you would see would be a sort of large village on Manhattan Island at the mouth of the Hudson River. And if you went back to the time of your grandfather's great-great-grandfather, I fancy you would see nothing on that island but trees and Indian wigwams beneath them. Not a single white man or a single house would you see. In the year 1609, just 2 years after Captain Smith sailed into the James River, a queer-looking Dutch vessel came across the ocean and began to prowl up and down the coast. It was named the Half Moon. It came from Holland, the land of the Dutch, but its captain was an Englishman named Henry Hudson, who had done so many daring things that the men called him the Bold Englishman. What Captain Hudson would have liked to do was to sail across the United States and come out into the Pacific Ocean, and so make his way to the rich countries of Asia. Was that not a funny notion? To think that he could sail across 3,000 miles of land and across great ranges of mountains. But you must not think Captain Hudson was crazy. Nobody then knew how wide America was. For all they knew, it might not be 50 miles wide. Captain John Smith tried to get across it by sailing up James River, and Captain Hudson fancied he might find some stream that led from one ocean to the other. So he went up and down the coast looking for an opening. After a while, the Half Moon sailed into a broad and beautiful bay, where great trees came down to the edge of the water and Indians paddled about in their canoes. Captain Hudson was delighted to see it. It was, he said, as pleasant with grass and flowers as he had ever seen, and very sweet smells. So the chapter goes on to talk about Henry Hudson drinking brandy and giving it to the natives. They came on the ship and drank with him, and he drank so much that he passed out on the deck, and they thought that he was dead, and so forth, so on. They tried sailing down the river, and he didn't get very far, and so he turned back. But he was having a great time, saying things like, "It was a very good land to fall in with," said Captain Hudson, "and pleasant to see." So he turned back and they left him there, which is kind of weird. So crew got desperate and they put the captain and some others out into an open boat on the wide waters and turned back again. So the crew was done sailing, and it sounds like they put Henry Hudson and some of the crew on a little boat and they just kind of sailed away. So I guess we could pretend that maybe they lived with the natives and had a really great life. So let me read this next chapter. But he had told the Dutch people all about the Hudson River, and the Indians had many fine furs, which they would be glad to trade for beads and knives and other cheap things. The Dutch were fond of trading and liked to make a good bargain, so they soon began to send ships to America. They built a fort and some log huts on Manhattan Island, and a number of them stayed there to trade with the Indians. They paid the Indians for the island with some cheap goods worth about $24. I do not think any of you could guess the great city of New York stands where the log huts of the Dutch traders once stood, and $24 would hardly buy as much as you could cover with your hand. As much land as you could cover with your hand. I mean, I can't even hardly get a lunch at Los Tacos #1 for $24, or a round of coffees at 1000 Coffee.
This graph shows One World Trade, Empire State, 432 Park Avenue condominiums, Bank of America, Condé Nast Building, Chrysler Building, and the New York Times. ConocoPhillips is Alaska's tallest building.
I could go into a lot more things like, I don't know, vehicles, public transportation. Obviously, public transportation in New York is pretty excellent. I mean, maybe not compared to other cities that have subway systems that are cleaner and more efficient and more well-funded. But here we have the People Mover, and that, that's a pretty decent bus system. We don't have any trolleys or anything like that. Of course, there's a lot of planes that fly around here. There's a lot of planes that fly around in New York. I could go deeper into the airports, speaking of planes, and like their elevation and more stuff about all of that, and the weather patterns. Did I already say firehouses? I could talk about firehouses, schools, demographics, but I don't really see a reason to go into all of that. I just wanted to go over some of the highlights. And so I'm thinking I could make a video about more about the history stuff in New York, which would be really fun, I think, to actually go there and video me at different places like Francis Tavern and the Ulysses S. Grant Memorial. That's something I didn't get to see, and like City Hall. And of course those videos are already there, but there's just nothing like making them yourself and being able to watch them for years to come. I'm going to definitely do more videos about Alaska. We have a lot of really interesting topics that we can cover. So Alaska used to be Russia a long time ago, and that reminds me, so Alaska was purchased from Russia. Alaska used to be a different country, and Manhattan also used to be a different country. It was New Amsterdam. So we both used to be different countries. And of course, that's just the southern tip of New Amsterdam. But there's some similarities. I just feel like there must be some reason why me from here is such a weird nerd that I like New York so much. I mean, maybe it's just some family connections. I don't know. Actually, I had a family member there once who sang a concert at Carnegie Hall. That was so exciting. So thank you so much for joining me on every single one of these New York adventures. I hope I didn't leave anything out statistics wise, and I hope that you enjoyed. So just spreading messages of love. I figure the more you know, the more you can tolerate, and the more it just makes life a more rich and colorful experience. So just please always be kind, and remember that everybody is just doing their best, and people are still struggling since the pandemic. So let's just all help each other as much as we can to promote a peaceful, really great quality of life, and drink your water, eat your whole foods, get lots of exercise, get your acupuncture, massage, and do your qigong and yoga. Okay. That's not very much. Listen to your classical music too, because that's good for the brain. And I will see you next time. Bye.